So hello, everyone, and welcome to the 10th Bite-Size Talk. We're happy to have the support of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to keep this series going, and we hope you're enjoying them too. As usual, if you have any questions for our speaker during the session, please put them in the chat box, and I will read them out at the end of the talk. Alternatively, keep the discussion going after the talk and post your questions in the Bite-Size channel on Slack and connect with our speaker directly. So our speaker today is James Fellows Yates from the LMU and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany. He will be talking to us about how to make a new institutional profile that will not only cover the steps of constructing one, but will more importantly also highlight the information that one needs to gather before getting started. With that, over to you, James.
Thank you very much. So yes, as Renuka just kindly did for me, sort of the overview of today's talk will be briefly recapping the benefits of using NF Core institutional profiles, describe the information you should generally gather before writing one. Then I'll go step by step how to build such a profile, and then finally how to test it. So today, more specifically, I'll be talking about global institutional profiles. And this is what I'm defining in today's talk as a Nextflow configuration file that is used by all NF Core pipelines to work efficiently on institutional level clusters, and that are stored on the NF Core configs GitHub repository. There's another thing called pipeline institutional profiles, but that is something for a future bite size. So firstly, why would you want to use an institutional profile? So these give you a lot of efficiency regarding Nextflow runs in terms of computing resources and time. So making sure you use only what you need and not exceed it and block other people on your given cluster. They're very portable, so this has this reproducibility. So it means other people can run the same command you ran, just but configured to their own cluster. And also ultimately writing this config file saves a lot of time. You write it once, and then everyone on that cluster can benefit from it. So as a brief recap of bytesize 2, which is what Maxime gave back a month or two ago. A Nextflow configuration file is a simple text file containing a set of properties, so parameters and stuff. So this is stuff that basically Nextflow can read and understand. This can be pipeline parameters. This can be information about sort of locations of files and so on. And there are different levels of these configuration files. So whenever a Nextflow run starts, it will look in the Nextflow config file that may be present in your run directory. It will also check your home directory for the .nextflow config file. You can also specify custom config files with the -c parameter to a Nextflow run. And also in NF Core pipelines, there's a whole nother layer, which is called the NF Core profiles, which, like I said before, are stored in NF Core configs. And this is generally where we store our institutional profiles. While I say that this is stored on the GitHub repository, that's not to say that you can't run these offline. So if you have a cluster which has a lot of offline nodes, you can also use NF Core tools to basically clone these config files to your cluster. And so as an example of what exactly I mean by these profiles and how you can use them. So let's say I want to run NF Core giga on the UpMax cluster in Sweden. I can simply write Nextflow run NF Core giga and then specify in the profile UpMax, which is the institutional profile, and then all the other parameters I want to do. But like I said, these profiles can apply to all pipelines. So you can also switch, like at the bottom, to NF Core mag, and the same thing will work, but just everything optimized for that particular cluster. You can also chain multiple institutional profiles together if you need. So for example, in the second example, we've got the dash profile SSH for the MPI in Jena, but there's multiple clusters, and therefore you can specify within that the specific cluster within that institution you want to use. And something that's very important to remind you, as in Maxime's talk, is that the order of the profiles are very important. So anything on the furthest right will overwrite anything previously. So any parameter set in the STag profile will overwrite any parameter also set in the SSH profile in this given example. So let's say you want to write an institutional profile for your particular cluster. There are multiple things you may want to cover. And this is the information that you want to gather before you start writing the profile. So I'll cover things like names, resource limits, scheduling systems, and also containers. So the first question you want to ask is, what name do you want to call your cluster profile? This should be something that's very recognizable and also descriptive. So descriptive so that your users of your cluster can recognize which cluster it's referring to, but equally not something that is too generic that people might get confused with their own clusters. Short is also very good. Abbreviations are okay, for example, like the SSH example I gave earlier. But again, it should be still precise that people know exactly what it is. By compact, I mean that, like I said, with the SSH example, if you have multiple clusters in one institution, it might make more sense to, rather than have one profile for each cluster, but an umbrella name for the institution itself. And then within that, you can have internal profiles, which I'll give more examples later on. So make sure you get the right level of hierarchy there. Once you decide on a name, you need to go into your cluster and get some information about the specifications of that. So for example, you should look for the resource limits of that particular cluster. So NF core pipelines expand on the Nextflow retry system, where if a process times out because it runs out of memory or runs out of wall time, Nextflow will resubmit that job with more memory or time or whatever. However, NF core adds these limits to ensure that this retry system doesn't go run away and start requesting more than is actually physically available on the system. And so for this, you need to look up the largest node that all users of your particular cluster can access, and find out what is the most amount of memory, CPUs, and wall times that they have. So for example, a 2 terabyte node with 112 cores, and the longest wall time that you can have is something like 7 days. In addition, you should also look up whether scratch usage is required by your cluster. So this is like a space which doesn't get backed up, where all your working directories, working files go into. Once you've found that, you need to look into your scheduling system. So assuming that your cluster has one, not all do, but assuming they do, you should check what scheduler you have and whether the Nextflow supports that. So a scheduler, if you don't know what it is basically a tool which allows the computer to distribute jobs where resources are available for you, and based on sometimes on priorities. So for example, you should also look up if your scheduler has queues or partitions, often based on, for example, wall time, which means that the shorter jobs will go earlier in the queue, whereas longer jobs go further down. You should find out the names of these and what specifications you may have for those. You should also look if there are any submission limits. So for example, can you only submit X number of jobs at any one moment? And also, are there any additional configurations that you may have, which you would normally write when you're writing your own custom batch scripts, that you feed to the scheduler? So something like you need to load certain modules. Then finally, you should look into containers. So NF core highly promotes the use of container systems. This is stuff like Docker, Singularity, and so on, which are basically allow you to put all of the software in a single file that a pipeline needs, and then you just download that file with all the tools set up and configured in the way it needs for the pipeline to run successfully. And basically allows for much more robust reproducibility, because everyone will always use exactly the same parameters and so on. And so you should check whether your cluster offers the use of these, so which container engine, and check if NF core actually supports this, because NF core has specific profiles for this. So this is stuff like Docker, Singularity, Charlie Cloud, Podman, and a couple of others. You should check if your cluster has a common cache location. So this is a directory where all the images are stored in one place that all users can access to prevent loads of users having the same copies of the same image, and whether you need any additional parameters to these container engines, for example, bind paths and so on. So once you have all this information, you can get into start writing. So to do this, we'd recommend starting with making a fork of the NF core configs repository. You don't have to do this, but generally just makes life a bit easier down the stream when you want to basically merge everything in. You then can make a branch to follow GitHub best practices and just name it after the cluster name you've picked. And then also open a tab with the Nextflow documentation, because often you'd have to refer to this quite a lot. Once you've made your fork and made your branch, you then need to create 2 new files, one under the configuration directory, which is where you're going to actually put the configuration file itself, also a documentation file in Markdown format and docs, and then you need to add your profile name to these 3 files, which is how NF Core uses to organize a lot of this stuff. It's quite straightforward where to put your name there. Just have a look in there, and you'll find where the long lists of the other profiles are. Then to write the profile itself, so in the configuration file, you can then start by writing the param scope. So this is basically standard Nextflow parameters, which you often specify in the command line of a Nextflow run. So for NF Core profiles, we generally suggest that you add these config profile description, contact URL. This is useful later on for debugging, but also it makes it easier for users to know that they're using the right profile when they're running their parameters. Then in the max parameters that you see in the 4th to 6th line, you can specify the maximum node information that you gathered earlier, so the maximum memory that's available, number of CPUs, and so on. And also if you have, for example, a common directory for things like reference files, which you use in the Nextflow pipelines themselves. For example, the Illumina iGenomes resource, you can also specify this here. Once you specify that, you can then write the process scope. So this is actually where you define generic information about your particular scheduler. So in the simple example above, which is what some clusters can simply have, you just specify you're using Slurm, and maybe you want to add an additional security check that you can only retry a maximum of 2 times, again, to stop runaway processes before you hit the big resource nodes. In a more complex example, you can also specify queues and do this dynamically. So using a Groovy expression, you can say, for example, if your process is we're going to request less than 2 hours, you can go to the short queue. If not, ask, is it going to run less than 24 hours? If so, it goes to the medium queue, and everything else then go to long. Which, sorry, I just realized I'm scrolling on the wrong window. So as you can see this here. And then also if, for example, in your SBatch script or your batch scripts for your scheduler that you manually write normally, and you have to specify specific extra parameters in that like header block that you normally get, you can also see this in the cluster options here, where I've done this dynamically, saying that in my SGE batch script, I need to specify the hvmem parameter, and I can take the Nextflow task memory information using the Groovy curly brackets. Then you can specify a few more information about your particular scheduler in the executor scope. This is typically just limits, for example, the queue size, which is maybe you only want to have 8 running processes for any given pipeline run. And also you want to say, I only want to submit 10 processes per second, so you can limit that there as well. Again, I highly recommend to check the Nextflow documentation. There's many more options that you can put here, and these are just a couple of examples. And finally, we have, not finally, so the second penultimate scope, we have the container scope. There is typically 1 per container system. So for example, there'll be 1 for Singularity, 1 for Docker, 1 for Podman, and all will have their own special settings. But common ones are, for example, you want to tell Nextflow to use that particular container system. So you enable that with the true variable there. You can also specify the cache directory here. So this is if you do have that common directory where all people's images go into, so everyone can reuse the same files, you can specify that in this scope. And finally, in our configuration file, if you do have multiple clusters within your particular institution, you can specify this in the profile scopes here. So for example, in my example cluster here, institution here, I've got the red cluster and the blue cluster, which you should be able to see here. And you can see here that they have different max memory parameters or max CPU parameters. And this is how you specify that there. These will basically overwrite anything which are specified in the base institutional profile. And again, you should add a description just specifying which cluster you're using that, so people can check loading it the correct one. Alternatively, if you want to do some magic, you can also click on the link below on the host names. So all the slides should be on the NF Core website if you want to come back to this later on. But use the host names example in the upmax profile, which allows you to actually dynamically set the parameters of different clusters based on the host names of the machines themselves. Then moving on to documentation. In the Markdown file, there's a range of things you should include. So you should give a brief description of where the cluster is based, so people know that they're getting the right one. You can give a summary of the parameters that you have set, just so they know what to expect when they're running the profile, for example, the resource limits or the queues. You should also write instructions for user level configuration. So if, for example, there is no common cache directory for all users for, let's say, the Singularity or Docker containers, and you want to specify this at a user level, you should describe this here. And also you can describe what other sub-profiles or internal profiles of your particular institution you may have. And once it's all ready, we can then test and submit. So to test the profile from your fork, you can use the special nfcore flag custom config base here, and you basically give this raw URL, replacing your GitHub user and then your branch, and then just run this command with your favorite pipeline and using the test profile we recommend to see if it runs. Now, you should expect trial and error here. Every cluster or every institution has their own special quirks, so it can take a bit of time, but don't give up. Once you get there, you're much more familiar with the cluster and it's much more straightforward. Things you should look for when testing is things like checking, do you see the correct description name in the run header? So this the description, URL, and contact of your particular profile gets displayed in the Nextflow, the nfcore run header. So this is where the ASCII logo is, and you should be able to see that there. And so if you see this, you know you're on the right track. You should also check when you're running the pipeline, are your jobs being submitted to the queue that you're expecting to? You can see, are you seeing your jobs being listed in your S account, your sort of job log history? So for example, in Slurm, that's with S account. So you can just check that they are being displayed and so on, because if they're not, you might still be running on the head node, which is a bit scary. And finally, you can also check your cache directories to check, do you have your containers in there as you specified. And so once it's all running and you've tested everything, you can then submit to nfcore configs. So you can pull on Slack, request a review on the request review channel. And once it's approved, you can merge it in and publicize. So tell all the potential Nextflow users in your cluster that they can use the profile. And they simply just have to run Nextflow run, their pipeline, dash profile, and then the name of the cluster with the additional parameters you may have. And so to conclude, if you need any help, you can always go to the nfcore configs repository, ask questions there, or check the documentation. We've also just merged in the tutorial, which is a long form, step-by-step and detailed version of this presentation. If you need more help, you can go to join the nfcore Slack workspace and ask questions on the configs channel. And the next bytesize, I believe, will be about development environments and workflows that will be hosted next week at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, James. Does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll read them out. So I'll wait like a minute or so to see if anything pops up. Yeah, I don't see anything. Oh, yes.
Yes.
Comment from Phil saying, remember to add your institution to the web page too. He's talking to all the contributors. Yes.
So then that helps people find out if your institutional profile is already there or not.
Yes.